The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 1, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 7, Side 2. Lovelier than this vague memory of some catastrophic inundation is the vegetation myth of Ishtar and Tammuz. In the Sumerian form of the tale, Tammuz is Ishtar's young brother. In the Babylonian form, he is sometimes her lover, sometimes her son. Both forms seem to have entered into the myths of Venus and Adonis, Demeter and Persephone, and 100 scattered legends of death and resurrection. Tammuz, son of the great god Ea, is a shepherd pasturing his flock under the great tree Erida, which covers the whole earth with its shade, when Ishtar, always insatiable, falls in love with him and chooses him to be the spouse of her youth. But Tammuz, like Adonis, is gored to death by a wild boar, and descends, like all the dead, into that dark subterranean Hades, which the Babylonians called Aralu, and over which they set as ruler Ishtar's jealous sister, Ereshkigal. Ishtar, mourning inconsolably, resolves to go down to Aralu and restore Tammuz to life by bathing his wounds in the waters of a healing spring. Soon she appears at the gates of Hades in all her imperious beauty and demands entrance. The tablets tell the story vigorously. When Ereshkigal heard this, as when one hews down a tamarisk, she trembled. As when one cuts a reed, she shook. What has moved her heart? What has stirred her liver? Ho there, does this one wish to dwell with me? To eat clay as food? To drink dust as wine? I weep for the men who have left their wives. I weep for the wives torn from the embrace of their husbands, for the little ones cut off before their time. Go, gatekeeper, open thy gate for her. Deal with her according to the ancient decree. The ancient decree is that none but the nude shall enter Aralu. Therefore, at each of the successive gates through which Ishtar must pass, the keeper divests her of some garment or ornament, first her crown, then her earrings, then her necklace, then the ornaments from her bosom, then her many-jeweled girdle, then the spangles from her hands and feet, and lastly her loincloth, and Ishtar, protesting gracefully, yields. Now when Ishtar had gone down into the land of no return, Ereshkigal saw her and was angered at her presence. Ishtar without reflection threw herself at her. Ereshkigal opened her mouth and spoke to Namtar, her messenger. Go, Namtar, imprison her in my palace. Send against her 60 diseases, eye disease against her eyes, disease of the side against her side, foot disease against her foot, heart disease against her heart, head disease against her head, against her whole being. While Ishtar is detained in Hades by these sisterly attentions, the earth, missing the inspiration of her presence, forgets incredibly all the arts and ways of love. Plant no longer fertilizes plant, vegetation languishes, animals experience no heat, men cease to yearn. After the lady Ishtar had gone down into the land of no return, the bull did not mount the cow, the ass approached not the she-ass. To the maid in the street no man drew near, the man slept in his apartment, the maid slept by herself. Population begins to diminish, and the gods note with alarm a sharp decline in the number of offerings from the earth. In panic they command Ereshkigal to release Ishtar. It is done, but Ishtar refuses to return to the surface of the earth unless she is allowed to take Tammuz with her. She wins her point, passes triumphantly through the 7 gates, receives her loincloth, her spangles, her girdle, her pectorals, her necklace, her earrings, and her crown. As she appears, plants grow and bloom again, the land swells with food, and every animal resumes the business of reproducing his kind. Love, stronger than death, is restored to its rightful place as master of gods and men. To the modern scholar it is only an admirable legend, symbolizing delightfully the yearly death and rebirth of the soil, and that omnipotence of Venus which Lucretius was to celebrate in his own strong verse. To the Babylonians it was sacred history, faithfully believed and annually commemorated in a day of mourning and wailing for the dead Tammuz, followed by riotous rejoicing over his resurrection. Nevertheless, the Babylonian derived no satisfaction from the idea of personal immortality. His religion was terrestrially practical. When he prayed, he asked not for celestial rewards, but for earthly goods. He could not trust his gods beyond the grave. It is true that one text speaks of Marduk as he who gives back life to the dead, and the story of the flood represents its 2 survivors as living forever. But for the most part the Babylonian conception of another life was like that of the Greeks. Dead men, saints and villains, geniuses and idiots alike, went to a dark and shadowy realm within the bowels of the earth, and none of them saw the light again. There was a heaven, but only for the gods. The Aralu to which all men descended was a place frequently of punishment, never of joy. There the dead lay bound hand and foot forever, shivering with cold, and subject to hunger and thirst unless their children placed food periodically in their graves. Those who had been especially wicked on earth were subjected to horrible tortures. Leprosy consumed them, or some other of the diseases which Nergal and Alat, male and female lords of Aralu, had arranged for their rectification. Most bodies were buried in vaults. A few were cremated, and their remains were preserved in urns. The dead body was not embalmed, but professional mourners washed and perfumed it, clad it presentably, painted its cheeks, darkened its eyelids, put rings upon its fingers, and provided it with a change of linen. If the corpse was that of a woman, it was equipped with scent bottles, combs, cosmetic pencils, and eye paint to preserve its fragrance and complexion in the netherworld. If not properly buried, the dead would torment the living. If not buried at all, the soul would prowl about sewers and gutters for food, and might afflict an entire city with pestilence. It was a medley of ideas not as consistent as Euclid, but sufficing to prod the simple Babylonian to keep his gods and priests well fed. The usual offering was food and drink, for these had the advantage that if they were not entirely consumed by the gods, the surplus need not go to waste. A frequent sacrifice on Babylonian altars was the lamb, and an old Babylonian incantation strangely anticipates the symbolism of Judaism and Christianity. The lamb as a substitute for a man, the lamb he gives for his life. Sacrifice was a complex ritual requiring the expert services of a priest. Every act and word of the ceremony was settled by sacred tradition, and any amateur deviation from these forms might mean that the gods would eat without listening. In general, to the Babylonian, religion meant correct ritual rather than the good life. To do one's duty to the gods, one had to offer a proper sacrifice to the temples and recite the appropriate prayers. For the rest, he might cut out the eyes of his fallen enemy, cut off the hands and feet of captives, and roast their remainders alive in a furnace without much offense to heaven. To participate in, or reverently to attend, long and solemn processions like those in which the priests carried from sanctuary to sanctuary the image of Marduk, and performed the sacred drama of his death and resurrection, to anoint the idols with sweet-scented oils, to burn incense before them, clothe them with rich vestments, or adorn them with jewelry, to offer up the virginity of their daughters in the great festival of Ishtar, to put food and drink before the gods, and to be generous to the priests, these were the essential works of the devout Babylonian soul. Perhaps we misjudge him, as doubtless the future will misjudge us from the fragments that accident will rescue from our decay. Some of the finest literary relics of the Babylonians are prayers that breathe a profound and sincere piety. Hear the proud Nebuchadrezzar, humbly addressing Marduk. Without thee, Lord, what could there be for the king thou lovest and dost call his name? Thou shalt bless his title as thou wilt, and unto him vouchsafe a path direct. I, the prince, obeying thee, am what thy hands have made. 'Tis thou who art my creator, entrusting me with the rule of hosts of men. According to thy mercy, Lord, turn into loving kindness thy dread power, and make to spring up in my heart a reverence for thy divinity. Give as thou thinkest best. The surviving literature abounds in hymns full of that passionate self-abasement with which the Semite tries to control and conceal his pride. Many of them take the character of penitential psalms and prepare us for the magnificent feeling and imagery of David. Who knows but they served as models for that many-headed muse? I, thy servant, full of sighs, cry unto thee. Thou acceptest the fervent prayer of him who is burdened with sin. Thou lookest upon a man, and that man lives. Look with true favor upon me, and accept my supplication. And then, as if uncertain of the sex of the god, How long, my God, how long, my goddess, until thy face be turned to me? How long, known and unknown God, until the anger of thy heart shall be appeased? How long, known and unknown goddess, until thy unfriendly heart be appeased? Mankind is perverted and has no judgment. Of all men who are alive, who knows anything? They do not know whether they do good or evil. O Lord, do not cast aside thy servant. He is cast into the mire. Take his hand. The sin which I have sinned, turn to mercy. The iniquity which I have committed, let the wind carry away. My many transgressions tear off like a garment. My God, my sins are 7 times 7. Forgive my sins. My goddess, my sins are 7 times 7. Forgive my sins. Forgive my sins, and I will humble myself before thee. May thy heart, as the heart of a mother who hath borne children, be glad. As a mother who hath borne children, as a father who hath begotten, may it be glad. Such psalms and hymns were sung sometimes by the priests, sometimes by the congregation, sometimes by both in strophe and antistrophe. Perhaps the strangest circumstance about them is that, like all the religious literature of Babylon, they were written in the ancient Sumerian language, which served the Babylonian and Assyrian churches precisely as Latin serves the Roman Catholic Church today. And just as a Catholic hymnal may juxtapose the Latin text to a vernacular translation, so some of the hymns that have come down to us from Mesopotamia have a Babylonian or Assyrian translation written between the lines of the classic Sumerian original, in the fashion of a contemporary schoolboy's interlinear. And as the form of these hymns and rituals led to the psalms of the Jews and the liturgy of the Roman Church, so their content presaged the pessimistic and sin-struck plaints of the Jews, the early Christians, and the modern Puritans. The sense of sin, though it did not interfere victoriously in Babylonian life, filled the Babylonian chants and rang a note that survives in all Semitic liturgies and their anti-Semitic derivatives. Lord, cries one hymn, my sins are many, great are my misdeeds. I sink under affliction, I can no longer raise my head. I turn to my merciful God to call upon him, and I groan. Lord, reject not thy servant. These groanings were rendered more sincere by the Babylonian conception of sin. Sin was no mere theoretical state of the soul. Like sickness, it was the possession of the body by a demon that might destroy it. Prayer was in the nature of an incantation against a demon that had come down upon the individual out of the ocean of magic forces in which the ancient Orient lived and moved. Everywhere in the Babylonian view these hostile demons lurked. They hid in strange crannies, slipped through doors or even through bolts and sockets, and pounced upon their victims in the form of illness or madness whenever some sin had withdrawn for a moment the beneficent guardianship of the gods. Giants, dwarfs, cripples, above all women, had sometimes the power, even with a glance of the evil eye, to infuse such a destructive spirit into the bodies of those toward whom they were ill-disposed. Partial protection against these demons was provided by the use of magic amulets, talismans, and kindred charms. Images of the gods, carried on the body, would usually suffice to frighten the devils away. Little stones, strung on a thread or a chain and hung about the neck, were especially effective, but care had to be taken that the stones were such as tradition associated with good luck, and the thread had to be of black, white, or red according to the purpose in view. Thread spun from virgin kids was particularly powerful, but in addition to such means it was wise also to exorcise the demon by fervent incantation and magic ritual, for example by sprinkling the body with water taken from the sacred streams, the Tigris or the Euphrates. Or an image of the demon could be made, placed on a boat, and sent over the water with a proper formula. If the boat could be made to capsize, so much the better. The demon might be persuaded by the appropriate incantation to leave its human victim and enter an animal, a bird, a pig, most frequently a lamb. Magic formulas for the elimination of demons, the avoidance of evil, and the provision of the future constitute the largest category in the Babylonian writings found in the library of Ashurbanipal. Some of the tablets are manuals of astrology, others are lists of omens, celestial and terrestrial, with expert advice for reading them. Others are treatises on the interpretation of dreams, rivaling in their ingenious incredibility the most advanced products of modern psychology. Still others offer instruction in divining the future by examining the entrails of animals, or by observing the form and position of a drop of oil let fall into a jar of water. Hepatoscopy, observation of the liver of animals, was a favorite method of divination among the Babylonian priests, and passed from them into the classical world, for the liver was believed to be the seat of the mind in both animals and men. No king would undertake a campaign or advance to a battle, no Babylonian would risk a crucial decision or begin an enterprise of great moment, without employing a priest or a soothsayer to read the omens for him in one or another of these recondite ways. Never was a civilization richer in superstitions. Every turn of chance, from the anomalies of birth to the varieties of death, received a popular, sometimes an official and sacerdotal interpretation in magical or supernatural terms. Every movement of the rivers, every aspect of the stars, every dream, Every unusual performance of man or beast revealed the future to the properly instructed Babylonian. The fate of a king could be forecast by observing the movements of a dog, just as we foretell the length of the winter by spying upon a groundhog. The superstitions of Babylonia seem ridiculous to us because they differ superficially from our own. There is hardly an absurdity of the past that cannot be found flourishing somewhere in the present. Underneath all civilization, ancient or modern, moved and still moves a sea of magic, superstition, and sorcery. Perhaps they will remain when the works of our reason have passed away. 5. The morals of Babylon. Religion divorced from morals, sacred prostitution, free love, marriage, adultery, divorce, the position of woman, the relaxation of morals. This religion, with all its failings, probably helped to prod the common Babylonian into some measure of decency and civic docility, else we should be hard put to explain the generosity of the kings to the priests. Apparently, however, it had no influence upon the morals of the upper classes in the later centuries, for, in the eyes and words of her prejudiced enemies, the whore of Babylon was a sink of iniquity, and a scandalous example of luxurious laxity to all the ancient world. Even Alexander, who was not above dying of drinking, was shocked by the morals of Babylon. The most striking feature of Babylonian life, to an alien observer, was the custom known to us chiefly from a famous page in Herodotus. Every native woman is obliged once in her life to sit in the temple of Venus and have intercourse with some stranger, and many disdaining to mix with the rest, being proud on account of their wealth, come in covered carriages and take up their station at the temple with a numerous train of servants attending them. But the far greater part do thus. Many sit down in the temple of Venus, wearing a crown of cord round their heads. Some are continually coming in, and others are going out. Passages marked out in a straight line lead in every direction through the women, along which strangers pass and make their choice. When a woman has once seated herself, she must not return home till some stranger has thrown a piece of silver into her lap, and lain with her outside the temple. He who throws the silver must say thus, "I beseech the goddess Melita to favor thee," for the Assyrians called Venus Melita. Assyrians meant for the Greeks both Assyrians and Babylonians. Melita was one of the forms of Ishtar. The silver may be ever so small, for she will not reject it, inasmuch as it is not lawful for her to do so, for such silver is accounted sacred. The woman follows the first man that throws, and refuses no one. But when she has had intercourse and has absolved herself from her obligation to the goddess, she returns home, and after that time, however great a sum you may give her, you will not gain possession of her. Those that are endowed with beauty and symmetry of shape are soon set free, but the deformed are detained a long time, from inability to satisfy the law, for some wait for a space of 3 or 4 years. What was the origin of this strange rite? Was it a relic of ancient sexual communism, a concession by the future bridegroom of the jus primae noctis, or right of the first night, to the community as represented by any casual and anonymous citizen? Was it due to the bridegroom's fear of harm from the violation of the taboo against shedding blood? Was it a physical preparation for marriage, such as is still practiced among some Australian tribes? Or was it simply a sacrifice to the goddess, an offering of first fruits? We do not know. Such women, of course, were not prostitutes, but various classes of prostitutes lived within the temple precincts, plied their trade there, and amassed, some of them, great fortunes. Such temple prostitutes were common in Western Asia. We find them in Israel, Phrygia, Phoenicia, Syria, etc. In Lydia and Cyprus, the girls earned their marriage dowries in this way. Sacred prostitution continued in Babylonia until abolished by Constantine, circa 325 A.D. Alongside it, in the wine shops kept by women, secular prostitution flourished. In general, the Babylonians were allowed considerable premarital experience. It was considered permissible for men and women to form unlicensed unions, trial marriages terminable at the will of either party. But the woman in such cases was obliged to wear an olive, in stone or terracotta, as a sign that she was a concubine. Some of the tablets indicate that the Babylonians wrote poems and sang songs of love, but all that remains of these is an occasional first line, like, "My love is a light," or "My heart is full of merriment and song." One letter, dating from 2100 B.C., is in the tone of Napoleon's early messages to Josephine. To Bibia, may Shamash and Marduk give thee health forever. I have sent to ask after thy health. Let me know how thou art. I have arrived in Babylon, and see thee not. I am very sad. Legal marriage was arranged by the parents, and was sanctioned by an exchange of gifts obviously descended from marriage by purchase. The suitor presented to the father of the bride a substantial present, but the father was expected to give her a dowry greater in value than the gift, so that it was difficult to say who was purchased, the woman or the man. Sometimes, however, the arrangement was unabashed purchase. Shamash Nazir, for example, received 10 shekels, or $50, as the price of his daughter. If we are to believe the father of history, those who had marriageable daughters used to bring them once a year to a place where a great number of men gathered round them. A public crier made them stand up and sold them all one after another. He began with the most beautiful, and having got a large sum for her, he put up the second fairest. But he only sold them on condition that the buyers married them. This very wise custom no longer exists. Despite these strange practices, Babylonian marriage seems to have been as monogamous and faithful as marriage in Christendom is today. Premarital freedom was followed by the rigid enforcement of marital fidelity. The adulterous wife and her paramour, according to the code, were drowned, unless the husband, in his mercy, preferred to let his wife off by turning her almost naked into the streets. Hammurabi out-Caesared Caesar. If the finger have been pointed at the wife of a man because of another man, and she have not been taken in lying with another man, for her husband's sake she shall throw herself into the river. Perhaps the law was intended as a discouragement to gossip. The man could divorce his wife simply by restoring her dowry to her and saying, "Thou art not my wife," but if she said to him, "Thou art not my husband," she was to be drowned. Childlessness, adultery, incompatibility, or careless management of the household might satisfy the law as ground for granting the man a divorce. Indeed, if she have not been a careful mistress, have gadded about, have neglected her house, and have belittled her children, they shall throw that woman into the water. As against this incredible severity of the code, we find that in practice the woman, though she might not divorce her husband, was free to leave him if she could show cruelty on his part and fidelity on her own. In such cases she could return to her parents and take her marriage portion with her, along with what other property she might have acquired. The women of England did not enjoy these rights till the end of the 19th century. If a woman's husband was kept from her through business or war for any length of time, and had left no means for her maintenance, she might cohabit with another man without legal prejudice to her reunion with her husband on the latter's return. In general, the position of woman in Babylonia was lower than in Egypt or Rome, and yet not worse than in classic Greece or medieval Europe. To carry out her many functions, begetting and rearing children, fetching water from the river or the public well, grinding corn, cooking, spinning, weaving, cleaning, she had to be free to go about in public very much like the man. She could own property, enjoy its income, sell and buy, inherit and bequeath. Some women kept shops and carried on commerce. Some even became scribes, indicating that girls as well as boys might receive an education. But the Semitic practice of giving almost limitless power to the oldest male of the family won out against any matriarchal tendencies that may have existed in prehistoric Mesopotamia. Among the upper classes, by a custom that led to the purdah of Islam and India, the women were confined to certain quarters of the house, and when they went out they were chaperoned by eunuchs and pages. Among the lower classes they were maternity machines, and if they had no dowry they were little more than slaves. The worship of Ishtar suggests a certain reverence for woman and motherhood, like the worship of Mary in the Middle Ages, but we get no glimpse of chivalry in Herodotus's report that the Babylonians, when besieged, had strangled their wives to prevent the consumption of their provisions. With some excuse, then, the Egyptians looked down upon the Babylonians as not quite civilized. We miss here the refinement of character and feeling indicated by Egyptian literature and art. When refinement came to Babylon, it was in the guise of an effeminate degeneracy. Young men dyed and curled their hair, perfumed their flesh, rouged their cheeks, and adorned themselves with necklaces, bangles, earrings, and pendants. After the Persian conquest, the death of self-respect brought an end of self-restraint. The manners of the courtesan crept into every class. Women of good family came to consider it mere courtesy to reveal their charms indiscriminately for the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And every man of the people in his poverty, if we may credit Herodotus, prostituted his daughters for money. "There is nothing more extraordinary than the manners of this city," wrote Quintus Curtius, 42 A.D., "and nowhere are things better arranged with a view to voluptuous pleasures." Morals grew lax when the temples grew rich. and the citizens of Babylon, wedded to delight, bore with equanimity the subjection of their city by the Kassites, the Assyrians, the Persians, and the Greeks. 6. Letters and literature. Cuneiform, its decipherment, language, literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Did this life of venery, piety, and trade receive any ennobling enshrinement in literary or artistic form? It is possible. We cannot judge a civilization from such fragments as the ocean of time has thrown up from the wreckage of Babylon. These fragments are chiefly liturgical, magical, and commercial. Whether through accident or through cultural poverty, Babylonia, like Assyria and Persia, has left us a very middling heritage of literature as compared with Egypt and Palestine. Its gifts were in commerce and law. Nevertheless, scribes were as numerous in cosmopolitan Babylon as in Memphis or Thebes. The art of writing was still young enough to give its master a high rank in society. It was the open sesame to governmental and sacerdotal office. Its possessor never failed to mention the distinction in narrating his deeds, and usually he engraved a notice of it on his cylinder seal, precisely as Christian scholars and gentlemen once listed their academic degrees on their cards. The Babylonians wrote in cuneiform upon tablets of damp clay, with a stylus or pencil cut at the end into a triangular prism or wedge. When the tablets were filled, they dried and baked them into strange but durable manuscripts of brick. If the thing written was a letter, it was dusted with powder and then wrapped in a clay envelope stamped with the sender's cylindrical seal. Tablets in jars, classified and arranged on shelves, filled numerous libraries in the temples and palaces of Babylonia. These Babylonian libraries are lost, but one of the greatest of them, that of Borsippa, was copied and preserved in the library of Ashurbanipal, whose 30,000 tablets are the main source of our knowledge of Babylonian life. The decipherment of Babylonian baffled students for centuries. Their final success is an honorable chapter in the history of scholarship. In 1802, Georg Grotefend, professor of Greek at the University of Göttingen, told the Göttingen Academy how for years he had puzzled over certain cuneiform inscriptions from ancient Persia, how at last he had identified 8 of the 42 characters used, and had made out the names of 3 kings in the inscriptions. There, for the most part, the matter rested until 1835, when Henry Rawlinson, a British diplomatic officer stationed in Persia, quite unaware of Grotefend's work, likewise worked out the names of Hystaspes, Darius, and Xerxes in an inscription couched in Old Persian, a cuneiform derivative of Babylonian script. And through these names, he finally deciphered the entire document. This, however, was not Babylonian. Rawlinson had still to find, like Champollion, a Rosetta Stone, in this case some inscription bearing the same text in Old Persian and Babylonian. He found it 300 feet high on an almost inaccessible rock at Behistun, in the mountains of Media, where Darius I had caused his carvers to engrave a record of his wars and victories in 3 languages, Old Persian, Assyrian, and Babylonian. Day after day Rawlinson risked himself on these rocks, often suspending himself by a rope, copying every character carefully, even making plastic impressions of all the engraved surfaces. After 12 years of work, he succeeded in translating both the Babylonian and the Assyrian texts in 1847. To test these and similar findings, the Royal Asiatic Society sent an unpublished cuneiform document to 4 Assyriologists and asked them, working without contact or communication with one another, to make independent translations. The 4 reports were found to be in almost complete agreement. Through these unheralded campaigns of scholarship, the perspective of history was enriched with a new civilization. The Babylonian language was a Semitic development of the old tongues of Sumeria and Akkad. It was written in characters originally Sumerian, but the vocabulary diverged in time, like French from Latin, into a language so different from Sumerian that the Babylonians had to compose dictionaries and grammars to transmit the old classic and sacerdotal tongue of Sumeria to young scholars and priests. Almost 1/4 of the tablets found in the Royal Library at Nineveh is devoted to dictionaries and grammars of the Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian languages. According to tradition, such dictionaries had been made as far back as Sargon of Akkad, so old is scholarship. In Babylonian, as in Sumerian, the characters represented not letters but syllables. Babylon never achieved an alphabet of its own, but remained content with a syllabary of some 300 signs. The memorizing of these syllabic symbols formed, with mathematics and religious instruction, the curriculum of the temple schools in which the priests imparted to the young as much as it was expedient for them to know. One excavation unearthed an ancient classroom in which the clay tablets of boys and girls who had copied virtuous maxims upon them some 2,000 years before Christ still lay on the floor, as if some almost welcome disaster had suddenly interrupted the lesson. The Babylonians, like the Phoenicians, looked upon letters as a device for facilitating business. They did not spend much of their clay upon literature. We find animal fables in verse, one generation of an endless dynasty, hymns in strict meter, sharply divided lines and elaborate stanzas, very little surviving secular verse, religious rituals presaging but never becoming drama, and tons of historiography. Official chroniclers recorded the piety and conquests of the kings, the vicissitudes of each temple, and the important events in the career of each city. Berosus, the most famous of Babylonian historians, circa 280 B.C., narrated with confidence full details concerning the creation of the world and the early history of man. The first king of Babylonia had been chosen by a god and had reigned 36,000 years. From the beginning of the world to the great flood, said Berosus, with praiseworthy exactitude and comparative moderation, there had elapsed 691,200 years. 12 broken tablets found in Ashurbanipal's library, and now in the British Museum, form the most fascinating relic of Mesopotamian literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh. Like the Iliad, it is an accretion of loosely connected stories, some of which go back to Sumeria 3000 B.C. Part of it is the Babylonian account of the flood. Gilgamesh was a legendary ruler of Uruk or Erech, a descendant of the Shamash-Napishtim, who had survived the deluge and had never died. Gilgamesh enters upon the scene as a sort of Adonis Samson, tall, massive, heroically powerful, and troublesomely handsome. 2/3 of him is God, 1/3 of him is man. There's none can match the form of his body. All things he saw, even to the ends of the earth. He underwent all, learned to know all. He peered through all secrets, through wisdom's mantle that veileth all. What was hidden he saw, what was covered he undid. Of times before the storm flood he brought report. He went on a long, far way, giving himself toil and distress, wrote then on a stone tablet the whole of his labor. Fathers complain to Ishtar that he leads their sons out to exhausting toil, building the walls through the day, through the night, and husbands complain that he leaves not a wife to her master, not a single virgin to her mother. Ishtar begs Gilgamesh's godmother, Aruru, to create another son equal to Gilgamesh and able to keep him busy in conflict, so that the husbands of Uruk may have peace. Aruru kneads a bit of clay, spits upon it, and molds from it the satyr Enkidu, a man with the strength of a boar, the mane of a lion, and the speed of a bird. Enkidu does not care for the society of men, but turns and lives with the animals. He browses with the gazelles, he sports with the creatures of the water, he quenches his thirst with the beasts of the field. A hunter tries to capture him with nets and traps, but fails, and going to Gilgamesh, the hunter begs for the loan of a priestess who may snare Enkidu with love. "Go, my hunter," says Gilgamesh, "take a priestess. When the beasts come to the watering place, let her display her beauty. He will see her, and his beasts that troop around him will be scattered." The hunter and the priestess go forth and find Enkidu. "There he is, woman. Loosen thy buckle, unveil thy delight, that he may take his fill of thee. Hang not back, take up his lust. When he sees thee, he will draw near. Open thy robe, that he rest upon thee. Arouse in him rapture, the work of woman. Then will he become a stranger to his wild beasts, who on his own steps grew up with him. His bosom will press against thee. Then the priestess loosened her buckle, unveiled her delight, for him to take his fill of her. She hung not back, she took up his lust, she opened her robe that he rest upon her. She aroused in him rapture, the work of woman. His bosom pressed against her. Enkidu forgot where he was born." For 6 days but 7 nights Enkidu remains with the sacred woman. When he tires of pleasure, he awakes to find his friends the animals gone, whereupon he swoons with sorrow. But the priestess chides him. "Thou who art superb as a god, why dost thou live among the beasts of the field? Come, I will conduct thee to Uruk, where is Gilgamesh, whose might is supreme." Ensnared by the vanity of praise and the conceit of his strength, Enkidu follows the priestess to Uruk, saying, "Lead me to the place where is Gilgamesh. I will fight with him and manifest to him my power." Whereat the gods and husbands are well pleased. But Gilgamesh overcomes him, first with strength, then with kindness. They become devoted friends. They march forth together to protect Uruk from Elam. They return glorious with exploits and victory. Gilgamesh put aside his war harness. He put on his white garments. He adorned himself with the royal insignia and bound on the diadem. Whereupon Ishtar, the insatiate, falls in love with him, raises her great eyes to him and says, "Come, Gilgamesh, be my husband thou. Thy love give it to me as a gift. Thou shalt be my spouse, and I shall be thy wife. I shall place thee in a chariot of lapis and gold, with golden wheels and mountings of onyx. Thou shalt be drawn in it by great lions, and thou shalt enter our house with the odorous incense of cedar wood. All the country by the sea shall embrace thy feet. Kings shall bow down before thee. The gifts of the mountains and the plains they will bring before thee as tribute." Gilgamesh rejects her and reminds her of the hard fate she has inflicted upon her varied lovers, including Tammuz, a hawk, a stallion, a gardener, and a lion. "Thou lovest me now," he tells her. "Afterwards thou wilt strike me as thou didst these." The angry Ishtar asks of the great god Anu that he create a wild Urus to kill Gilgamesh. Anu refuses and rebukes her. "Canst thou not remain quiet now that Gilgamesh has enumerated to thee thy unfaithfulness and ignominies?" She threatens that unless he grants her request, she will suspend throughout the universe all the impulses of desire and love, and so destroy every living thing. Anu yields and creates the ferocious Urus, but Gilgamesh, helped by Enkidu, overcomes the beast, and when Ishtar curses the hero, Enkidu throws a limb of the Urus into her face. Gilgamesh rejoices and is proud, but Ishtar strikes him down in the midst of his glory by afflicting Enkidu with a mortal illness. Mourning over the corpse of his friend, whom he has loved more than any woman, Gilgamesh wonders over the mystery of death. Is there no escape from that dull fatality? One man eluded it, Shamash-Napishtim. He would know the secret of deathlessness. Gilgamesh resolves to seek Shamash-Napishtim, even if he must cross the world to find him. The way leads through a mountain guarded by a pair of giants whose heads touch the sky and whose breasts reach down to Hades. But they let him pass, and he picks his way for 12 miles through a dark tunnel. He emerges upon the shore of a great ocean and sees far over the waters the throne of Sabitu, virgin goddess of the seas. He calls out to her to help him across the water. "If it cannot be done, I will lay me down on the land and die." Sabitu takes pity upon him and allows him to cross through 40 days of tempest to the happy island, where lives Shamash-Napishtim, possessor of immortal life. Gilgamesh begs of him the secret of deathlessness. Shamash-Napishtim answers by telling at length the story of the flood, and how the gods, relenting of their mad destructiveness, had made him and his wife immortal because they had preserved the human species. He offers Gilgamesh a plant whose fruit will confer renewed youth upon him who eats it, and Gilgamesh, happy, starts back on his long journey home. But on the way he stops to bathe, and while he bathes, a serpent crawls by and steals the plant. The snake was worshipped by many early peoples as a symbol of immortality because of its apparent power to escape death by molting its skin. Desolate, Gilgamesh reaches Uruk. He prays in temple after temple that Enkidu may be allowed to return to life, if only to speak to him for a moment. Enkidu appears, and Gilgamesh inquires of him the state of the dead. Enkidu answers, "I cannot tell it thee. If I were to open the earth before thee, if I were to tell thee that which I have seen, terror would overthrow thee. Thou wouldst faint away." Gilgamesh, symbol of that brave stupidity, philosophy, persists in his quest for truth. "Terror will overthrow me. I shall faint away, but tell it to me." Enkidu describes the miseries of Hades, and on this gloomy note the fragmentary epic ends. 7. Artists. The lesser arts: music, painting, sculpture, bas-relief, architecture. The story of Gilgamesh is almost the only example by which we may judge the literary art of Babylon. That a keen aesthetic sense, if not a profound creative spirit, survived to some degree the Babylonian absorption in commercial life, Epicurean recreation, and compensatory piety, may be seen in the chance relics of the minor arts: patiently glazed tiles, glittering stones, finely wrought bronze, iron, silver, and gold, delicate embroideries, soft rugs and richly dyed robes, luxurious tapestries, pedestaled tables, beds, and chairs. These lent grace, if not dignity or final worth, to Babylonian civilization. Jewelry abounded in quantity, but missed the subtle artistry of Egypt. It went in for a display of yellow metal, and thought it artistic to make entire statues of gold. There were many musical instruments, flutes, psalteries, harps, bagpipes, lyres, drums, horns, reed pipes, trumpets, cymbals, and tambourines. Orchestras played and singers sang, individually and chorally, in temples and palaces, and at the feasts of the well-to-do. Painting was purely subsidiary. It decorated walls and statuary, but made no attempt to become an independent art. We do not find among Babylonian ruins the distemper paintings that glorified the Egyptian tombs, or such frescoes as adorned the palaces of Crete. Babylonian sculpture remained similarly undeveloped and was apparently stiffened into an early death by conventions derived from Sumeria and enforced by the priests. All the faces portrayed are one face, all the kings have the same thick and muscular frame, all the captives are cast in one mold. Very little Babylonian statuary survives, and that without excuse. The bas-reliefs are better, but they too are stereotyped and crude. A great gulf separates them from the mobile vigor of the reliefs that the Egyptians had carved 1,000 years before. They reach sublimity only when they depict animals possessed of the silent dignity of nature or enraged by the cruelty of men. Babylonian architecture is safe from judgment now, for hardly any of its remains rise to more than a few feet above the sands, and there are no carved or painted representations among the relics to show us clearly the form and structure of palaces and temples. Houses were built of dried mud or among the rich of brick. They seldom knew windows, and their doors opened not upon the narrow street, but upon an interior court shaded from the sun. Tradition describes the better dwellings as rising to 3 or 4 stories in height. The temple was raised upon foundations level with the roofs of the houses whose life it was to dominate. Usually it was an enormous square of tilted masonry built, like the houses, around a court. In this court most of the religious ceremonies were performed. Near the temple in most cases rose a ziggurat, literally a high place, a tower of superimposed and diminishing cubical stories surrounded by external stairs. Its uses were partly religious, as a lofty shrine for the god, partly astronomic, as an observatory from which the priests could watch the all-revealing stars. The great ziggurat at Borsippa was called the Stages of the 7 Spheres. Each story was dedicated to one of the 7 planets known to Babylonia, and bore a symbolic color. The lowest was black, as the color of Saturn. The next above it was white, as the color of Venus. The next was purple for Jupiter, the 4th blue for Mercury, the 5th scarlet for Mars, the 6th silver for the Moon, the 7th gold for the Sun. These spheres and stars, beginning at the top, designated the days of the week. There was not much art in this architecture so far as we can vision it now. It was a mass of straight lines seeking the glory of size. This book is continued on Cassette 8, Side 1.